Hey everybody, Jordan Norell here, making my daily video about circumcision. And today I would like to talk about the fact that circumcision is an extreme human rights violation. I think this is something that is really important to understand and to emphasize because, we can argue about different aspects of circumcision, the medical side of it, the physical and sexual sides of it. There have been lots of people on both sides. It's just a kind of a stupid argument because it's really obvious that of course it has sexual effects, and of course there is little or no or negative. In fact, I'd say there's very obviously a negative medical benefit. There's medical harm, actually very obvious. But I'm not going to go into all that. I mean, people argue about it a lot. What's really not arguable is that it's a human rights violation, and also that it causes enormous psychological harm to a lot of men. So the reason that is because you're taking a boy and removing part of his genitals, part of his body that he, at some point in the future, may very likely value to an extremely high degree. We know that a lot of men do value that very much. And you are taking his body and you are removing a part of that. It's his human right to have the body that he was born with. It's so intuitive, it's so basic, it's so common sense that it's hard to even say that much about it because it's so obvious. There's nothing more fundamentally that you own than your own body, and especially your genitals, the part of you that is intended to give you pleasure. In particular, your foreskin is the most innervated, most sensitive part of the penis by far. No one really argues about this. If you simply look at the studies, it's clear that it's the most sensitive part, and I haven't seen any refutation of that. I've seen the study repeated. It's clear that the foreskin is the most sensitive part of the penis, and many men have reported this. And the fact that you're removing that, and again, as many adult men who have been circumcised report, there's an extreme loss of pleasure. And a lot of men are extremely, extremely upset about that. How can that not be one of the most fundamental violations of human being possible when, sexual pleasure is one of the most exquisite things that a human being can experience. It's an act of enormous love to have sex with someone who you are have a huge emotional connection with. It can also be not that deep of a thing, but I don't think anyone questions that sexual pleasure is one of the most extraordinary, beautiful, powerful, pleasurable parts of being a human, and that you are very likely damaging that by circumcising a child and taking away a decision. He can decide for himself if he wants to get circumcised when he's an adult, and there's no argument against that. It can be completely up to him, and then there's absolutely no and there's no real reason that it shouldn't be left to him. The same thing with a girl, same thing with intersex, same thing with any human being in any decision that doesn't have to be made by their parent because they can make it themselves when they're of age, especially about their own body and how much of it they get to keep. It's absurd that you would say you should remove a part of somebody's body, any part of their body. Just think about any other part of their body. Should you remove their fingernails, their eyelids, any part of a girl's genitalia, any part, even if it's less important than the foreskin, which the foreskin is, again, it's the most sensitive part of the man's penis. There's no question about that. Just look at the Sorrell study. It's very clear. And so it's very obviously a human rights violation, and that it is taking away something that should be one of the most fundamental things that is part of our humanity, and that there's no real reason for doing that and for not leaving it up to the boy himself. There's just absolutely no reason. And it's sad that as parents, parents don't usually think that way and don't think of their child as a human being because it's a child, because we think of them as less than human somehow, or as property somehow, and that's not how we should ever think of a child. I would argue that actually very strongly in a lot of ways that are less popular, and including that we shouldn't indoctrinate our child into any kind of ideology. But that's for a different story, and that we shouldn't force our children to into certain ways of thinking or living their lives in a certain way when there's not necessarily justification for doing so. But anyways, as parents, at the very least, we need to think of our children as the adults that they will become in terms of decisions that really don't need to be made, like this, like circumcision, which again, a lot of men come to resent extremely strongly, and you can't go back. And you need to consider that that child will one day be an adult, and that many of the adults who have had this done are extremely upset about it. And that number is quickly growing to the point where it will soon be the majority of the population who feel it's an extreme violation that they've been circumcised. And that leads me to the other point, that it's a psychological harm as well. So many men that I've seen have extreme trauma, extreme PTSD, symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphia, although that's a misnomer of term, because body dysmorphia means you see something as being wrong with your body when it's perfectly fine. In this case, there actually is an extreme harm and damage that's arguably been done to the body. But symptoms of that, extreme depression, and even suicide, I've seen from circumcision. And there's just no question that it can cause that, and in fact does pretty frequently, and in a very quickly growing number of men. And that, you can argue, like I said, about the other things. You can't argue about that. It's very easy to prove that men have been directly traumatized in an extreme degree by circumcision, and that if we didn't do that, that wouldn't have happened to them. There aren't any intact men with extreme trauma that they didn't get circumcised. If they're upset about it or have issues, then they can get circumcised. I have even seen adult men who were left intact and then thought, well, I should be like others who are around me who are circumcised, and so they do the same, and then they can even be very traumatized and extremely upset about it. And so yeah, it's really important to recognize that circumcision is both very clearly a human rights violation, and that it causes extreme trauma in many men, very, very clearly, who've had no problems before and then learned about circumcision and then went into spiraling depressions and developed extreme trauma symptoms as a result. It's just very, very clear if you look at innumerable case studies, as you can pretty easily on the internet. You can find a lot of men who suffer from this, and that number is sadly growing. It's good that people are realizing how harmful it is, and I hope that the word continues to spread very quickly, and that we continue to work together to find solutions, both physically, like Foragen, who's trying to regenerate the foreskin, and psychologically, like what I'm doing right now. I'm trying to develop material that will help men who are traumatized and upset over circumcision. So yeah, ultimately we need to stop violating children's rights by circumcising them, and we need to find solutions for those who are already affected, because it's hundreds of millions of men around the world, and very soon I think a majority of them will be aware and angry, rightfully so, and are going to need our help. And so let's start working towards a solution. Thanks, guys.